Hello and welcome to Alta Live. If you are filling in to this Alta Live Zoom room for a conversation on this extraordinary new book from Pen America, The Sentences That Create Us, you are absolutely in the right place. My name is Beth Spotswood. I'm Alta's digital editor, and I am so excited to welcome all of you today. I know we've got an enthusiastic crowd, so welcome, welcome. I'm very excited to welcome our guests today. We have, so basically we're going to talk about this amazing new book from Pen America, The Sentences That Create Us, Crafting a Writer's Life in Prison, with Caits Meissner and Piper Kerman. Caits, who is Pen America's Director of Prison and Justice Writing, edited this book, and it's dozens of contributors, including Piper Kerman. Piper is an activist and educator and author, most notably of Orange is the New Black. Caits and Piper will be in conversation with Alta Journal books editor David L. Ulin. Before I turn things over to David, some brief housekeeping. You're at Alta Live. This is the digital event series we host every Wednesday here at Alta Journal. If you're unfamiliar with Alta Journal, we are an award-winning quarterly magazine focused on California and the West. We feature the best writing from and about the West Coast. We host a monthly book club. In fact, tomorrow night, we host Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Natalie Diaz at 5 p.m. We'll send you a link to that. And we deliver this incredible magazine to mailboxes every quarter. So if you are interested in what we do, I do hope you'll check us out at altaonline.com today. This interview is being recorded and will be posted to altaonline.com later today. So if you miss any part of it, don't worry, we'll get it to you. We're going to shoot you an email with links to where you can find this book, more information about Pen America, invitations to future Alta events. There is a Q&A button underneath. Please use that to ask any questions you have of Caits, Piper, and David, and we'll get to those at the end of the chat. With that, I am so grateful to our guests, and David L. Ulin, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Beth. Welcome, Piper, and welcome, Caits. I'm delighted to have a chance to talk with you both about this book. As I was just saying before we got started, this is a fantastic book on every level. It's one of the best sort of like one-stop shops for writing information, both in terms of form and professional stuff that I've ever seen. So I'm grateful to have it, both as a writer and as a teacher of writing also. What I thought we would do is kind of start a little bit with some context. So I'm wondering, Caits, if you can talk a little bit to start us off about the kind of the history of the Pen America Prison and Justice Writing Program, and then we can kind of move from that into a kind of discussion of the history of this book. I know that there have been a number of iterations of this book in the past, and that this is a kind of a radical reimagining of it and expansion of it. But let's start with the program and what its history is.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, David, and thanks, Alta. Great to be here with my friend Piper. The Pen America Prison Writing Program has been around for over 40 years. It was formed by a small grassroots community of activists and advocates and writers on the heels of the Attica uprising, with the assertion that writing is a legitimate form of power, which I always, of course, really loved. And over the years, what that's evolved to be is the Pen America Prison and Justice Writing Program. So just a little bit about what we do. For about 30 plus years, we've been running a contest for incarcerated writers. We have thousands of entries across the country, award in 6 genres, publication, we have staged readings, there's cash prizes, and we have an ongoing mentor program where about 300 writers outside work with writers inside. And then we had the Handbook, which was a big part of our programming as well. The department really expanded when we brought the Writing for Justice Fellowship on. And now we have a lot of programs in the pipeline that are ready to be coming to fruition later. But that's the basic history of it. Oh, I lost you.
No, I was muted. My phone went off, so I was muted to make sure that we didn't have, we didn't have a phone situation here. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of the history of the handbook? This new edition grew out of a kind of a sort of grassroots handbook that developed sort of incrementally, and I'm curious about kind of both the history of it and also the decision to revamp it and reinvent it.
Absolutely. Well, I knew the Handbook for Writers in Prison by PEN America because I taught in prisons. So I knew it was a resource that I would get for my students every year. I thought it was quite incredible that it was sent for free to anybody in the country who requested it. And excuse me, you have here New York City dogs in the background. Here we are on Zoom, as always. Not my dogs. And where was I? So essentially it grew from a photocopied pamphlet, as I understand it, with this prison writing committee of volunteers at Penn who really took it into all these different iterations. And the last version that I inherited was an 110 page, pretty slim volume that was passed hand to hand, marked up. People would find out about it from a prison library resource guide from 20 years ago. It really had this robust sort of legacy. Somebody said to me when they were writing for this book, that's like writing for the big book of AA, writing for the rewrite of this book, but like in the literary community, which I love. And the way that it evolved is essentially, though I really thought the guide was important to a lot of people and certainly had a lot of interesting information, I thought, what makes it different from any other craft book? How do we really make this responsive to the needs of writers in prison, especially at this time in the conversation of mass incarceration? And the former prison writing program director who had been overseeing the program for 20 years, Jackson Taylor, said, I think you should make a new book. And then my boss, Drew Medeker, said, I think we could make a new book. And so, you know, it's not only, it comes out of that legacy, but it is completely different content.
Caits is being very modest. She has been a transformative force in many ways for the program, but I cannot overstate that this new revision, this new version of the handbook is a beautiful thing. And I'm familiar with the old handbook, which was also fantastic, but this is really an invaluable update.
Piper, can you talk about your involvement with the program and also your involvement? I mean, people know you as the author of Orange is the New Black and know about that, your experience, your carceral experience through that book. But what they may or may not know is that you've been, teaching workshops in prisons and things like. And so I'm curious if you can talk a bit about your own involvement in the project and also in the process.
Sure. So like most incarcerated people, I was aware of Penn's prison writing program, though where I was incarcerated, we had incredibly limited access to outside materials. So those few wonderful free resources were very, very valuable. After I came home from prison in 2005, I began to get involved and interested with a variety of organizations that were doing good work that as a formerly incarcerated person, I had a strong sense would make a difference for, the literally millions of our own people that we lock away. When Caits came on board at Penn, I was thrilled with all of the visionary thinking that she brought to the role and the changes that have been wrought there. And when she said that she wanted to redo the handbook and she asked if I would be willing to be one of the 50 plus contributors, I was thrilled. I taught for over 4 years in state prisons in Ohio, starting out just on our own as a writing program. And then eventually we began to collaborate with a private university in Ohio that started conferring college credits to our students. And I can say from that sort of crucible experience of teaching in that setting, I taught in both a men's prison and a women's prison, that the contents of this book are invaluable because most incarcerated people do not have access to an established writing program. Most incarcerated people are just sort of trying to figure out a way to make their locked up time creative or productive on their own steam, which is why something so rich, I mean, when people get their hands on this book and are able to sort of start digging into both not only the craft aspects, but also pragmatic questions like how do I get published if I'm incarcerated, and also the philosophical questions. And that's what Caits asked me to write about is, both the pragmatic, but I think really the philosophical questions of writing about people that who are similarly caught up in the criminal legal system, or possibly also, folks on the outs. Caits, I wanted to tell you that I already heard from one of my Ohio students that he received his copy. The Mellon Foundation is sending 75,000 copies to incarcerated writers or aspiring writers. And Caits, I got the email, via JPay, and I was thrilled. And he says thank you.
Oh, I love to hear that. I love to hear that, Piper. And just to give a little behind the scenes of our conversation, Piper said, "Sure, what do you want me to write about?" And I think this is a great story to show the internals of the book, right? Because Piper's essay is called Burn the Spot, on writing about people you know, and burn the spot is a prison term. Don't burn the spot when people were smoking contraband cigarettes, as Piper opens this highly readable essay. And my sense is that the advice, Piper, that you give is advice that I need as a writer, that anybody needs as a writer, but you put it in this particular context of both yourself, and of course, everyone in prison loves Orange is the New Black. I taught in a women's prison when it was on air, and they were like, "We can't get it out of the library. It's always gone," the actual book. So the big question that people have is around these stories people are telling us, how do I do it ethically? So I think your essay is a fantastic example of both opening up space for people on the outside to understand the conditions of prison and how people commune and how people write, but also it's really for anybody who has that question about, how do I do this? How do I write about folks in my life without burning bridges, or, in prison, potentially, getting somebody's life in trouble,
Sure. Yeah,
well,
absolutely.
I wanted to ask about this essay. I mean, I think I agree. It's a terrific essay, and it does what a lot of the essays in this book do, which is to kind of merge personal anecdote or personal experience, the experience of the writer of the essay, with something practical or pragmatic. I mean, I think the ethical question of what do we do about the people we write about? How do we treat them ethically, and how do we ethically think about what we're exposing is a universal, but as you say, much more kind of pragmatically fraught if that person is incarcerated, and what you're revealing could either affect their status, with fellow incarcerated people or with the prison administration. I wanted to get a and I really particularly like the advice in the essay of, when you're writing the draft, just write the draft and then go through, and in revision, you can, that's where you can make those ethical decisions. I wanted to talk a bit about that notion of, because one of the things that this book does, like, puts front and center, is the necessity and power of voice, or the fact that voice itself, the ability to express oneself, to use one's voice, that the essay about the 26 letters and that technology, there is no all you need is 26 letters, and everybody has access to the same 26 letters. I wonder if you can both talk about the kind of, I hate to use the word empowerment because it's more than that, but the sort of empowerment of voice, and how essential that is, not just as a way to fill the time, but as a way to kind of seize the time in a certain way for people who are incarcerated.
Yeah, I would say I'll jump in, and Caits, I know you're going to weigh in on that too. So for incarcerated people, if we think about sort of the most familiar narrative building blocks and the most familiar tropes that we all learn from the time we're very, very small, protagonist, antagonist, for incarcerated people who have obviously been cast in the role of antagonist in some way, at minimum by the state, and potentially by other people as well. The question of voice and where you stand in the story, I'm very narratively oriented. One of the things I love about the book is that it's not just focused on sort of traditional narrative structures, though they are in there. There are other modalities of writing that are covered. But that question of where do I stand in the story? Am I the protagonist? Am I the antagonist? Maybe I'm neither. Is really important. I mean, I'll tell you a quick story that I think illuminates that question of power in terms of an authorial voice. So I taught in both a men's medium security prison and the primary women's prison in Ohio. And we did start out with traditional narrative structure because I knew that it would be the most familiar modality for the students who have a variety of educational attainment and experience to come around. And the men took to writing about themselves as protagonists like fish to water. And for the women, it took longer. And it's hard to imagine a more marginalized group of human beings, a more disempowered group of people than the people who end up in women's prisons in this country. So the idea that you, as the author of the story, have the power to make the decisions about how this story is going to be told, that if you're writing about yourself as a protagonist, and my class was a personal narrative nonfiction class, that, your own desires drive the story, even if they're unmet, even if your own desires are thwarted, that's a really important thing for the reader to comprehend and potentially to get on board with. And the women, the women entered into the experience of the class with higher language attainment and more sort of like on paper ability as writers, but it took longer for them to really feel comfortable with the power of their own writing. And that was really an interesting and an illuminating thing for me to observe as a teacher.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Caits, do you want to jump in on this?
Always. I have so many things to say, but yes, the power dynamics of the world in terms of gender are never as on display as in prisons. I had the same experience in my women's class. There'd be a roll of toilet paper in the middle of the floor for our emotional expression. And the men were like, I want to get it right. I think, across this book, there's a lot of different essays that address this. And I want to just point out a few topically. Yeah. So I think, just taking it back to the basics, who knows who's listening on this call, but when you have no personal agency in the system, what's been impressive to me about the writers I've worked with and what I've learned from them is that it's all in the imagination. And so I think finding your voice is finding yourself and finding, purpose to live, a way to express, a way to make value, and then beyond. So, Alejo Rodriguez has a fantastic essay in the book called "And Still I Write: Creative Expression for Self-Advocacy," where he talks about his poetry classroom after 13 attempts at going to the parole board and being denied, finally saying, wait a sec, I need to talk like myself. Let me use the voice of my poetry and bring it to the board, and then it worked. Now, wasn't that linear? Who knows? We know we make it for the story too. Or Vivian Nixon talks about teaching women how to write essays through how to write grievances and put them through the system for things that, we know that the grievance process is fraught and sometimes does nothing and sometimes gets people in trouble. But that framework I thought was so brilliant for how to think about structuring an essay. So my sense is that that voice has an application in prison, finding voice that is from as practical as I need to be able to advocate for myself to come home, and to as creative as I'm building, like any of us on the outside who identify as writers, I'm building an identity in the world. But also I think that tapping into voice builds community through the walls. It gives access to also creating relationships with family through the walls. A lot of folks will say, I want to learn how to write so I can write better letters to my girlfriend, for example. So I think we're really looking at with this project, how does voice influence your writing as a capital W writer, like some of us, and how does it also help you become a better person potentially, which is a big charge for writing, but I think it has some potential.
And in a place or setting, as a number of the writers in this book talk about, where your humanity is stripped away in its very essence. You're assigned a number. You belong to the state, or you're presented as belonging to the state. So you're not just your agency, but your very self, your identity is removed, forcibly removed. That being, that it seems like putting a lot on writing, but writing can become a radical, revolutionary act of reclaiming oneself in some way, and reclaiming one's, not just one's identity, but one's dignity, one's agency. Again, even if, as there's another essay in which the writer talks about, a lot of writers don't need to get published. They're not writing to get published. They're writing to express themselves, which I think is a really important point that often gets overlooked. But in a carceral circumstance, it really is a matter of self-assertion, just to simply say, here's my story. I'm going to tell this story.
Yeah, I think, David, even when writing lost, now we're seeing book bans across the country. It's writing is dangerous again. But when there was a time where people sometimes felt like, Neruda got exiled, writing isn't dangerous anymore. I said, well, there's one place that it's still very dangerous, and that's prison. in the United States.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Piper, you were going to say something?
I was just going to say, you're absolutely right that sort of, writing can be this very solitary endeavor in many ways. But one of the things that I love about the book, one of the brilliant, things that the editor did was the inclusion of a section on creating a writing community in prison. So again, the opportunity to participate in a writing workshop or writing class is phenomenal, but very, very rare. But there's incredibly pragmatic and really rich advice in here about incarcerated people forming their own writing circles or writing workshops or writing communities. And I can't overstate that there is this incredible importance to, the voice and the basic act of resistance of writing, no matter what form or modality you're choosing. If you're locked up and incarcerated and, they have tried to reduce you to that number and the uniform that you're forced to wear. But the opportunity to engage with other writers, I heard from another student of mine who is home now. And sadly, he wrote to let me know that his mother had passed. And I was like, I'm so sorry. I'm really glad you were home with her rather than still locked up. And he said, I learned so much from your class. I learned, that helped me go through this because I know that I'm not the only one who suffers or who's going through these things. And that sense of community is an essential, it's a lifeline to survive the experience of incarceration, whether you're doing short time or whether you're trying to navigate a life sentence. So I'm very grateful, Caits, that you included that as part of this incredible workbook. I think of it as a workbook, but resource guide, because I think it's something that people don't always think about when they think about, prison writing. They think about that individual writer, but any of us who, who do this sort of strange work know that writing is, in fact, good writing is really collaborative.
I have a question about that. I think that I also thought that was an incredible part of the book because it shows that we can create community at the grassroots level wherever we are. It only requires a couple of individuals coming together and deciding that they want to create community, and there's immense power in that as well. In your essay, Piper, which begins with the kind of banning of cigarettes at the prison you were in, you talk about a kind of shift in opportunity, let's say, for incarcerated people in terms of, as conservative sort of approaches to criminality or prison come into play, all of these things like writing workshops, educational opportunities get kind of cut back because they're seen as indulgences, right? It becomes a much more punishment, but whatever that means, becomes more the goal rather than kind of thinking about people in prison as human beings. And so I'm wondering, is it harder now, given the kind of, given our general social and political attitude towards criminal justice? Is it harder now than it was, say, 15, 20 years ago to kind of enact these sorts of programs, from the outside? How has the situation changed? And is there hope for programs to be expanded in this way? It flies in the face of sort of what I think of as conservative false ideas about who's human and who's not, obviously. And so that kind of reasserting the humanity of incarcerated people through the creation or the redevelopment of these kinds of programs.
I hear from old heads and, people who did time way back in, the 70s. There was this, this shift, this very profound shift, which we now refer to as the policies of mass incarceration, which kicked in hard in the 80s and the 90s and made incarceration that much more of a punitive experience. And of course, vastly increased the number of our own people that we lock up. So sometimes I hear from old heads that, that there were a lot more programs. Certainly we know if we look at things like access to higher ed in prison, that there was a time when there was more access to education than there is now. I would say, state control and state violence, there may be ebbs and flows in terms of what's permitted or what's highlighted, But at the end of the day, prisons are always punitive, even the most theoretically rehabilitative prisons, like actually the men's prison where I taught, are still places of punishment. I would say that the big sea change, I hope, is that there are far more people now on the outside who are interested in what is happening on the inside. And so the book, I think, is a phenomenal resource for anyone who is interested in potentially engaging in creative work across over the wire, through the bars, over the fence, whatever metaphor you want to use, to think about, how to potentially do that. I think, the prisons that permit some sort of permeableness of the walls in terms of allowing people from the outside to come in are the ones that, demonstrate the greatest respect for the humanity of the people that they cage. But I think that's the big sea change, is that there's far, far more people on the outside who are more aware, who are paying more attention to what is happening behind the walls to people, and who are interested in work like the work that's in here.
Okay.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think that's right. And my sense is that if you are in a prison that's not near a big city, you're pretty screwed, because the artists are the ones that want to come inside. And so I often hear from folks, living in, as we affectionately refer to it, as the boondocks here in New York City, that there are plenty of programming deserts. In fact, Arthur Longworth writes in his essay that he reads about these classes, Piper's class, he's read about, Wally Lamb's class, and he's like, I relish it, but I've never had it. And so how have I carved space for myself? So actually, this is not fully publicized yet, but part of what we're doing with this book is developing curriculum for and launching 20 writing groups over 20 years, over 2 years, good Lord, where we're really looking at bringing incarcerated individuals into a leadership training program with prison librarians as institutional partners. Because if you don't have space and you're trying to do a covert, you're using, flying kites, as it's called, sending notes or trying to get together on the yard. And during COVID, things really shut down and things are really restricted. So we're looking at what's an institutional ally that can help create the space, but then the leader could be the incarcerated person. And how do we use this book and some leadership training to really say, it's wonderful when people want to come from the outside in, but the prison won't always allow it. We get that question all the time. How do I start it? And I'm like, it is prison to prison.
Yeah.
Yep.
You got to call the warden or the programs person and try to figure it out. There's no system. There's nothing you can Google. It's all grassroots, trial and error. So my instinct was there's enough talent behind the walls to use a real lens of self-determination. So how do we put the power in people's hands? But I will also say that anytime, my sense is from going to many prisons, anytime somebody from the outside comes in, it brings a taste of the outside world, and that is invaluable.
And that, I want to ask one more question and then I will open it up to the Q&A, but that brings me to the notion of the books that are sitting behind Piper on the screen, which, as Piper said before we started, many of them are written by people in this book. And it seems to me that the encouragement or in whatever way for people to write allows people also to imagine, again, not just a personal agency, but allows people to imagine themselves in a bigger way, which prison is designed to squash, and allows them to imagine a life beyond prison, and it kind of not only imagine, but actually activate in a lot of ways. So Piper, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the books behind you and in regard to that sort of lens.
Sure. When I started teaching, when I started the program in Ohio, the first year we read 22 books by currently or formerly incarcerated people, or a few by people who were directly impacted by incarceration. So, here's Asha Bendele's The Prisoner's Wife. Over here, Dwayne Betts wrote the foreword to The Sentences That Created Us. This is his memoir of being sent to an adult prison when he was still a child. And I chose that because I knew it's one thing for me, sort of a blonde, white, college-educated lady, to be like, I wrote a prison memoir, you can do it too. But it was really important for me to make manifest to my students that all of these different people had found their voice, and not only found their voice, but been successful in publishing and written, full-length books and done many, many other things. I was really lucky that I was able to entice a couple of those writers to come and visit my class. Mitch Jackson is in this book. His incredible essay on revision, which is probably, one of the single most important things for writers to think about. And Mitch just won the Pulitzer Prize, which, I was corresponding. I stay in touch and I email with my students who are still incarcerated all the time. And one of them has sent me a manuscript for a novel that he wrote. And he was like, I'm not going to win the Pulitzer Prize. And I was like, oh, yeah, well, guess who just did? So remember when Mitch Jackson came to class? So I just think, to make things manifest, to remind people of what is possible is one of the most important things that each and every one of us has to do in this life. And it's particularly important with sort of the oppression and despair that does dwell in the criminal legal system, to hang on to hope.
I agree.
If I could just tag on to that with just a little story I was sharing with everybody earlier, I'll try to keep it brief, but Piper, that you really hit the nail on the head with the intention of this book was to put a sense of possibility. I sort of thought about it as being inspirational, instructional, aspirational, and historical were the guiding principles. And thinking about an interview with someone like a Wilbert Rideau, who hasn't given an interview in 15 years, but he was an NPR fresh air correspondent from prison. I mean, he is a banana story. And then you get, here's just a real life example of how I hoped and imagined, and the folks who contributed to this book also hoped and imagined, that this would start to create community in the unseen diaspora of people in prison, if I can say it that way. Mm-hmm. And here's the story. Yesterday, I was testifying in court on behalf of a writer in this book. In fact, Arthur, who I mentioned earlier, has been in prison over 30 years and is a critical voice on talking about the foster care to prison pipeline. And I was testifying about the power of writing, and his writing in particular, and my belief that if he comes home, he'll be a much more powerful advocate. I found out a few hours later that he had his sentence commuted. He had been in prison since he was a teenager as well. The same day, I get an email from John J. Lennon over at JPay, who's an incarcerated writer, very active, featured in this book, saying, hey, I want to review Arthur's book that he talks about. I said, John, the book's not out yet. It's just a manuscript. And he said, well, here, I'm going to put you in touch with my agent. And so here's Arthur coming home from prison with an agent knocking on his door because of another profoundly engaged and talented incarcerated writer finding his work in this book. And to me, that is mind-blowing. And just the idea of being able to see other people who've accomplished incredible things that are in your same condition, I think that is going to be, talk about opening possibility. It can't come from anybody else, right?
Right. And that's kind of a macrocosmic expression of this community, of the community idea, the grassroots community idea that you're talking about. The community gets built from the ground up. So we have a couple of questions in the chat. One, this is going back to sort of what you were talking about, Piper, in terms of the difference between teaching men and women. Mm-hmm. So one of the questions has to do with how you were able to help women find the power that they needed. What were you able to do that encouraged them to see themselves and write about themselves through that more powerful lens?
One of the approaches that I had was to structure things like writing prompts in a way that was always designed to sort of grow their, skills, capabilities, craft, and yet was in no way coercive in terms of saying you have to write about this topic or this kind of a story. So it was important to have that class be always a liberatory experience. And I think that was particularly important for the women who, the men that I had in class were survivors of incredible amounts of trauma. I think almost every man in my class had been, stabbed, shot, assaulted, otherwise physically harmed. Some of them had been victims of sexual violence. And that's even more true when you talk about incarcerated women. So the choice to sort of write about whatever the hell you want seems so obvious, and yet it's really, really important in a correctional context. I just was patient to a certain extent. And I think just the insistence that their stories are really important and interesting is something that, for many incarcerated people, and especially for incarcerated women and other, LGBTQ folks, people may have never heard anyone tell them that their stories are important and the stories that they want to tell are important stories. So it just requires some patience and persistence in that regard. Certainly the message, that you're not a cork bobbing in the waves, you're a fish swimming in the ocean, is one that's really important for people who are doing that sort of personal narrative nonfiction writing. But it's also incredibly important if you're doing fiction and creating character. Nobody wants a character, whether it's true, quote unquote true, or quote unquote fiction, that doesn't have a sense of agency. So that sort of gets to the heart of, one of the reasons that I wanted to teach anyway, was that, I know from my own experience that sense of agency is critically important to my survival. Both outside in the world and more so if incarcerated. So, those were some of the approaches, but it really stood out initially. Believe me, the women caught up in terms of.
I'm sure, yeah. Is there a difference, and I don't know if this is a sort of a jump ball question, I guess, but is there a difference in terms of, the book does kind of take us through all sorts of different genres, including, as you say, some genres that are not traditional or not, don't fall into the neat fiction, nonfiction, poetry category. But is there a difference and Caits, maybe you can address this, in teaching different genres or different forms? Is there a difference? What are the strategies that emerge in a poetry writing workshop as opposed to a fiction workshop or a nonfiction workshop?
How much can I speak to that from personal experience? I always have taught poetry, so I don't know, but or English comp, but not in prison, and hopefully never again. My sense in editing these chapters and working with writers in the book is that there's actually far more in common that you come to through writing any genre than there, the heart of it is all the same. It's very similar craft advice. It's very similar advice around finding your voice, around valuing your story, around working through the trauma that comes out through the writing. And but I do think when I've taught poetry, it lends itself much more to a kind of socio-emotional lens. Like I said, the kind of camaraderie in the room. So when I think about when I taught women, a lot of what I would do is try to step back and really let the room hold each other. And people really showed up for it. And it seemed to me, from what people said, to be a very different space of trust than the rest of the prison environment. And that trust got challenged on a number of occasions, and we'd have to deal with it. But there was this real sense of, we have to be able to be honest here, because out of this classroom, forget it, it's every woman for themselves. That's an exaggeration. Certainly camaraderie happens, and Piper knows that better than I do. And I think that, that's really valuable in one way, but it's also equally valuable to be teaching journalism. But I do see gender differences in how we transfer. I don't think I've seen, maybe any, I could be wrong about this, don't quote me, any prison newspapers coming out of a women's facility.
They might have one in Indiana. That prison, the Indiana Women's Prison, is a very curious and unusual place. That's the place that has the incredible history program that Michelle Jones, who's now getting, I believe, her doctorate. So there are these curious things that grow up in individual prisons that remind us of what incredible fertile ground, the minds and the experience of the people who are trapped there really are, and what, how the extent to which we are squandering, the richness of our own people when we exile them. But yeah, all those things are true, Caits. I can't overstate the value of having a writing community, whether it's, the formality of a class or just what and I have a number of students who continue to work in community, because that's such a powerful demonstration of, things like voice. Like when you're in community doing the writing and sharing with one another in a space that's as safe as is possible in a prison, that's when you're like, oh yeah, she totally has that voice and I have a completely different voice. She's good at those things. I'm good at this stuff. There are always different aspects of writing that some people have incredible sort of native strength. And then, we point up the things that we sort of crave more of when we are hearing a draft or reading a draft. But that's the beauty of being able to do it in community.
And also, I think, and I'll just say this briefly, like Zeke Caliaguri's essay about building writing community in prisons and starting an incarcerated-led collective was actually my first idea for the book, because he told me the story in person when I visited the prison he was in. He's like, great, PEN America, let me tell you about what I did. I was like, Zeke, you're going to write that essay, aren't you? He said, yes, I will. And my sense is that essay is as much about organizing as it is about writing community. And so I think there's a way in which the principles of organizing a writing group are the principles of just organizing, period. So I'll leave it there.
We're just about out of time, but there's one question in the chat that I know there's one question in the chat that I really want to ask you all. So I hope everybody's willing to stay for a couple of extra minutes. Someone asks there, I would like to ask, if I may, about structuring writing classes targeted for incarcerated individuals who have an intellectual disability and limited literary skills. And I do think that's a really important question. So I was wondering, I'd love to hear what both of you have to say about that, or about that.
It's a really good question. Because the majority of incarcerated people lack even a high school diploma when they are incarcerated. Many people earn their GEDs while they're incarcerated. But I would observe that even my most brilliant students, in these classes had generally profoundly negative experiences with formal educational systems prior to incarceration, which is part of, what feeds people into the beast. I had a variety of students. And so I would say, when we started class, the way I had the luxury of 2 hours of class time. So, and the access to a lot of reading material. So I was able to get books donated. I was able to get full-length books into the prison. You can't take these things for granted. So I would say, if I was thinking about, opportunities, creative opportunities for folks who maybe hadn't earned their GED, as an example, that one of the things I said to my students is, if you want to be a writer, you better be a reader. That's my advice. And that's the requirement of this class. So reading was, we always were grounded in reading materials, even when we had been at it for years. And I had some students who stuck with me for like 4 years. We never made people leave class. We began to spend less time focused on the readings and more time focused on their own work and revisions and those processes. But we always stuck with the readings to some extent. And so that is something that I would definitely do, a class that was, if I was teaching a class for folks who had not yet attained their GEDs, as an example, I would, teach, carefully selected readings as a grounding point for then informing the writing. That would be sort of a core strategy.
Okay. Couple thoughts on this too. Thanks, Piper. That's all great. And I did have that experience of having some folks that were much lower level language learners or speakers, for example. And I think there's a couple ways that I would deal with it. One is there's an essay in this book about storytelling, no paper or pen needed, community storytelling, which takes it out of the realm of literacy entirely and brings it into the air. So that's one play. And that's still, I believe it's still a form of writing, especially if you look at where history brings us with poetry and other cultures that are not a Western influence, but looking at griots, etc. I think about a poet like Pedro Petrie, who's one of my favorites and is super accessible. And then you bring a variety of reading materials, so underscore. But I also think we used to do, and this was what Rehabilitation Through the Arts, this was their ritual that I picked up. They in every class they ran, there would be an opening meditation that each person, different people in the class would do each week. And so I remember once having a student who was very held by the class, who was struggling in writing, but came and freestyled this meditation on the beach that was just wonderful. Mm-hmm. And I think lean into the skills and the love in the room. So thinking about how the participants help each other. And my third, whatever it is, thing I'll say is prompts that really have low stakes entry points. So things like a communal writing process where everyone writes a line and you build a group poem. Things like, honestly, sometimes I would take it down when I was teaching teenagers at Rikers Island, I would take it down to fill in the blank and build a poem almost like Mad Libs. And then we take away the scaffolding, see what's left and rearrange it, right? So I think, setting up people for success and having different, I also often give prompts that have different choices about how to approach it. So there might be something that's a really easy, low entry point, low overhead, and something that's a lot more challenging and open that people can kind of take their pick in.
No, I think that's really important. I think setting people up to succeed rather than to fail is absolutely essential at all levels, but certainly at the level where you're introducing people to the craft. We are out of time. I would go on for another hour. This has been fantastic. Thank you both. Thanks, Piper Kerman and Caits Meissner. In the chat, there are links for purchasing copies of The Sentences That Create Us from Bookshop, and also if you're a teacher and you want to apply for a teaching copy to see if you can use this book in the classroom. As I think I mentioned at the beginning, I will be using this book in the classroom from here on out. It is just a fantastic sort of wall-to-wall three-dimensional guide. Thank you both for being here, and thanks for the profound and important work you're doing. I'm really, really gratified to speak with you.
Truly.
Thanks everyone for coming today. Don't worry, this event has been recorded. We will email it to you with links to buy The Sentences That Create Us, links to support PEN America, links to check out Alta Journal, Piper's work, Caits' work, David's work. And please join us next Wednesday. We're hosting Wajahat Ali and his new book, Go Back to Where You Came From. So join us for that conversation Wednesday, February 23rd, if you can. David, you're awesome. And Caits and Piper, thank you again. Thank you everyone for coming. Stay safe. Take care.
Thank you.